Raiden Shogun, the eternal ruler of Inazuma, welcome to a journey through one of the most complex and tragic stories in all of Teyvat. Tonight, we explore the tale of the Raiden Shogun, the Electro Archon who rules over the nation of Inazuma with an iron fist and an eternal vision. This is a story of two sisters, of loss and eternity, of a god who tried to freeze time itself, and of the price paid by an entire nation for one being's pursuit of an impossible dream. Settle in as we unravel the layers of the Raiden Shogun, from her origins as one of twin gods through 500 years of rule, to the events that would finally challenge her understanding of eternity itself. This is not just the story of an Archon, but of what happens when grief becomes policy, when fear of loss transforms into tyranny, and when the pursuit of an ideal costs more than anyone should be willing to pay. Our story begins not with one god, but with two. Long ago, before Inazuma was the nation we know today, before the Electro Archon claimed her throne, there were twin gods born to the land of lightning and storms. They were Makoto and Ei, two sisters who shared a bond deeper than most could comprehend. They were not simply siblings, but complementary halves of a whole, each possessing qualities that balance the other perfectly. Makoto was the elder twin, though only by moments. She possessed a gentle nature, a love of beauty and culture, and a deep understanding of people and their needs. Makoto valued progress and growth, understanding that change was necessary for any nation to thrive. She was a ruler in the truest sense, someone who could see the bigger picture, who understood governance and diplomacy, who knew how to guide a nation toward prosperity. Ei, the younger twin, was different. Where Makoto was gentle, Ei was fierce. Where Makoto understood politics, Ei understood combat. Ei was a warrior without equal, a master of the blade whose skill in battle was legendary even among gods. She did not concern herself with the complexities of rule or the subtleties of diplomacy. Her role was simpler, clearer. She was the protector, the one who would ensure through strength of arms that no harm came to her sister or their people. The twins were inseparable, two sides of the same coin. Makoto ruled as the Electro Archon, taking the name Baal, while Ei served as her Kachimasha, her shadow warrior, the blade that defended the throne. This arrangement worked perfectly for centuries. Makoto handled the affairs of state, cultivating relationships with other nations, fostering the arts and culture within Inazuma, guiding her people toward enlightenment and prosperity. Meanwhile, Ei fought in the battles that needed fighting, dealt with threats both mortal and divine, and ensured that Inazuma remained safe and secure. The people of Inazuma never knew there were two. To them, there was only the Raiden Shogun, the Electro Archon, their god and ruler. They did not know that the god who appeared before them in court was Makoto, while the god who led armies to war was Ei. The twins kept their dual nature a secret, perhaps understanding that the people needed to believe in a single, unified divine authority. During this time, Inazuma flourished. Under Makoto's guidance, the nation developed a rich culture, beautiful arts, and sophisticated governance. The people were happy, prosperous, and secure. They worshipped their Archon with genuine devotion, grateful for the peace and prosperity she had brought them. It was a golden age, a time when everything seemed perfect and eternal. But perfection cannot last forever, and eternity is not what mortals think it is. The Archon War was a period of terrible conflict, when gods fought gods for dominance over Teyvat, when the very landscape was reshaped by divine combat, when entire civilizations rose and fell in the span of battles. The war was brutal, claiming the lives of countless gods and leaving only 7 standing. 7 who would become the Archons ruling over the 7 nations. Makoto and Ei fought together through this war, their combined strength ensuring victory after victory. But war changes people, even gods. Ei, who had always been a warrior, became hardened by the endless combat, by seeing gods she had known and respected fall in battle. She began to understand something terrible, that nothing lasts forever. that even the divine can be destroyed. That loss is inevitable no matter how strong you are. When the Archon War finally ended, Makoto and A were among the victors. Makoto claimed her place as one of the seven, the Electro Archon of Inazuma, while A continued her role as the hidden protector. They had survived where so many others had perished, and for a time it seemed that the worst was behind them. But the war had left scars, not just on the land but on those who fought in it. And 500 years before the present day, those scars would tear open in the most devastating way possible. The cataclysm, as it came to be known, was a disaster that shook all of Teyvat. In the nation of Conria, a civilization that had advanced without the guidance of gods, something went terribly wrong. The details are shrouded in mystery and conflicting accounts, but what is known is that Conria fell, and from its ruins emerged monsters and corruption that threatened to spread across the entire world. The seven Archons were called to deal with this threat, to contain the disaster before it consumed everything. Makoto answered this call, as was her duty as an Archon. She traveled to the site of the cataclysm to lend her power to the effort to contain it. A remained behind in Inazuma, protecting the nation in her sister's absence, as she had always done. But something went wrong. The cataclysm was more dangerous, more destructive than anyone had anticipated. Gods fell fighting it, and among them was Makoto. When A learned of her sister's death, something inside her shattered. The one constant in her existence, the person she had defined herself in relation to, was gone. Makoto, the gentle ruler who had guided Inazuma with wisdom and grace, who had understood people in progress and growth, was dead. And A, for all her strength, for all her skill in battle, had not been there to protect her. The grief was unbearable, but A did not have the luxury of mourning. She was now the Electro Archon, whether she wanted the role or not. The people of Inazuma still believed there was only one Raiden Shogun, and they could not know that their true ruler had died. A had to step out of the shadows and take her sister's place, not just as a warrior, but as a ruler. But A was not Makoto. She did not understand governance the way her sister had. She did not have Makoto's patience for diplomacy, her appreciation for culture and progress, her deep understanding of human nature. A was a warrior who suddenly found herself responsible for an entire nation, and she had no idea how to fulfill that responsibility in the way Makoto had. More than that, A was terrified. She had lost her sister despite all her strength. She had learned in the most painful way possible that nothing lasts, that even gods can die, that everything and everyone she cared about could be taken from her. This fear, this grief, this trauma would shape every decision she made for the next 500 years. A began to contemplate the nature of eternity. What did it mean for something to last forever? How could she, as the ruler of Inazuma, ensure that her nation would endure, that it would not fall as Conria had fallen, that it would not change and erode and eventually disappear like everything else seemed to? She came to a conclusion that seemed logical to her warrior's mind. If change led to loss, then the solution was to stop change entirely. If progress carried risks, then Inazuma should not progress. If new ideas and ambitions could lead to disaster as they had in Canria, then such things should be forbidden. The path to eternity was stasis, was preserving Inazuma exactly as it was in this moment, frozen in time like an insect preserved in amber. But A understood something else as well. She was not immortal, not truly. Gods could die, as her sister had proven. And even if she lived for thousands of years, she would change, would be worn down by time and experience, would eventually become something different from what she was now. How could she preserve Inazuma's eternity if she herself was subject to change and eventual destruction? They devised a solution that was brilliant and terrible in equal measure. She would create a puppet, a perfect replica of herself that would serve as the Raiden Shogun in her place. This puppet would be unchanging, incorruptible, immune to the erosion of time and the weakness of emotion. It would rule according to a set of absolute principles, never deviating, never compromising, ensuring that Inazuma remained exactly as A wanted it to be. And as for A herself, she would retreat into her consciousness, would seal herself away in a realm of pure meditation called the plane of euthymia. There, isolated from the world, she would pursue her understanding of eternity undisturbed. While her puppet ruled in her place, she would become unchanging through isolation, would preserve herself by removing herself from everything that might alter her. The creation of the Raiden Shogun puppet was a masterwork of divine craftsmanship and arcane engineering. It looked exactly like A, moved like her, fought like her, but it lacked something essential. The puppet had no true emotions, no capacity for growth or change, no ability to reconsider its programming or adapt to new circumstances. It was given a set of parameters for ruling Inazuma, a vision of eternity to enforce, and the power to carry out that vision without question or doubt. A placed her consciousness into the blade of a sword, a weapon called the Musuishin, which the puppet carried. From within this blade, A could observe the world when she chose to, could take control of the puppet's body in moments of extreme need, but otherwise remained in her meditative plane, contemplating eternity while her creation ruled in her stead. And so the Raiden Shogun, as the people knew her, became something both more and less than a god. She was an immortal ruler who never changed, never aged, never showed weakness or doubt. She was consistent, predictable, absolute. Inazuma began its long descent into stagnation. At first, the changes were subtle. The Raiden Shogun became more distant, less involved in the daily lives of her people. She delegated authority to the Tri-Commission, 3 governmental bodies that handled the practical matters of running the nation. The Tenryo Commission managed military affairs and law enforcement. The Kanjo Commission oversaw finances and borders. The Yashiro Commission handled cultural affairs and festivals. This system had existed under Makoto, but under the puppet shogun, it became the primary means of governance, with the Archon herself remaining remote and disconnected. The puppet enforced a vision of eternity that was rigid and uncompromising. Traditions were to be maintained exactly as they had always been. Innovation was discouraged. Change of any kind was viewed with suspicion. But for a time, this seemed acceptable. Inazuma had always been a traditional nation, and the people were used to their ways. The emphasis on preserving culture and custom seemed like a natural extension of their values. But then came the Vision Hunt decree, and everything changed. Visions are gifts from the gods, physical manifestations of ambition and desire granted to those whose aspirations burn bright enough to attract divine attention. Those who bear visions gain the ability to wield elemental power, to channel the very forces of nature through these crystalline focuses. In most nations of Teyvat, vision bearers are celebrated, their abilities seen as blessings that can benefit their communities. But the Raiden Shogun saw visions differently. To her, they represented ambition, change, the drive to pursue something beyond the present moment. They were symbols of human desire to transcend their current state, to achieve something greater. And that, in her view, was incompatible with eternity. Moreover, visions were tied to the gods, to the celestial powers that ruled Teyvat. The Raiden Shogun, driven by the programming A had given her, and perhaps by some echo of A's own trauma, came to believe that visions were dangerous. They granted power beyond mortal ken, power that could be misused, that could lead to disaster. Had not Kanria fallen through the misuse of power? Had not Makoto died in the cataclysm that resulted? And so the Raiden Shogun enacted the Vision Hunt decree. All visions in Inazuma were to be confiscated and embedded into a statue, a monument to the Archon's will. Those who possessed visions would have them taken by force if necessary, their ambitions literally stripped away from them. The effects of losing a vision are devastating. When a vision is taken from its bearer, something fundamental is lost. The ambition that drew the gods' attention, the quality that defined that person and made them special, fades away. Vision bearers who lose their visions become hollow versions of themselves, going through the motions of life without the drive or passion that once defined them. Some retain memories of who they were, tormented by the knowledge of what they have lost. Others forget entirely, becoming docile and empty. The Vision Hunt decree transformed Inazuma into a police state. The Tenryou Commission, led by the Kujo clan, enforced the decree with brutal efficiency. Vision bearers were hunted down, arrested, brought before the Raiden Shogun herself in ceremonies where their visions would be taken and embedded into the statue in front of Tenchukaku, the Shogun's palace. Those who resisted were dealt with harshly, labeled as criminals and traitors to Inazuma, but the decree did not stop there. To enforce it properly, Inazuma's borders were closed. A massive thunderstorm barrier was erected around the islands, preventing ships from entering or leaving. Any who tried to pass through the barrier would be struck by lightning and destroyed. Inazuma became isolated from the rest of Teyvat, cut off from trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. The Sakoku Decree, as this isolationist policy was called, had devastating effects on Inazuma's economy and society. Trade ground to a halt. Businesses that relied on imports or exports collapsed. Families were separated, with some members trapped outside Inazuma, unable to return, while others were imprisoned within, unable to leave. The nation that had once flourished under Makoto's rule became a cage for its own people. The Raiden Shogun justified these actions as necessary for eternity. Change came from outside influences, from new ideas and ambitions. By sealing Inazuma away from the world and suppressing ambition within, she believed she could preserve the nation in a perfect, unchanging state. The suffering of individuals was irrelevant compared to the eternal preservation of Inazuma as a concept. But not everyone accepted this vision of eternity. Resistance began to form, scattered at first, then coalescing into organized opposition. The Watatsumi Island forces, led by the shrine maiden Sangonomiya Kokomi, were among the first to actively resist. Watatsumi had always been somewhat separate from the rest of Inazuma. Worshipping different gods and maintaining their own traditions, they saw the Vision Hunt decree as tyranny and refused to comply. This led to open conflict, a civil war between the shogun's forces and the resistance. The resistance found support in unexpected places. Some within the Yashiro Commission, particularly the Kamisato clan, quietly aided those fleeing the Vision Hunt decree, providing resources and shelter to vision bearers in hiding. Smugglers and pirates found profit in helping people escape Inazuma despite the Sakoku decree, running the blockade at great risk to their lives. But the resistance faced an enemy far more powerful than any mortal army. The Raiden Shogun herself was a god, wielder of the Musu no Hitotachi, a legendary technique that could cleave through anything with a single strike. Her power was absolute, and those who challenged her directly faced certain death. The Fatui, the diplomatic and military organization from Snezhnaya, saw opportunity in Inazuma's chaos. They sent a harbinger, La Senora, to negotiate with the Raiden Shogun. The Fatui offered their support in exchange for certain concessions, though their true goals remained shrouded in secrecy. They manipulated the situation from the shadows, exacerbating the conflict for their own purposes. What the Raiden Shogun did not know, what she could not know in her isolated meditation, was that the Tenryou Commission had been corrupted. The head of the Kujo clan had been colluding with the Fatui, allowing them to operate freely within Inazuma and providing them with intelligence and resources. The Vision Hunt decree was being enforced far more brutally than even the Shogun had intended, with the Kujo forces using it as an excuse for tyranny and oppression. This corruption would have consequences that even the puppet could not ignore, but first, a catalyst was needed. Someone who could challenge the Shogun's vision of eternity and force, herself to confront what she had become. That catalyst arrived in the form of a traveler from beyond the stars, an outlander who had been searching for their lost sibling and stumbled into Inazuma's conflict. The traveler, despite lacking a vision, possessed the ability to wield elemental powers, a unique gift that allowed them to channel the elements through their connection to the statues of the seven found throughout Teyvat. The traveler quickly became involved in the resistance movement. They witnessed firsthand the suffering caused by the Vision Hunt decree, met people who had lost their visions and their sense of self, saw families torn apart by the Sakoku decree. They learned about the civil war raging between the shogunate and Watatsumi forces, about the resistance fighters struggling against impossible odds. But more importantly, the traveler learned about visions and ambition in a way the Raiden Shogun never had. They met Kaedahara Kazuha, a wandering samurai whose best friend had been executed by the Raiden Shogun for daring to challenge the Vision Hunt decree. Kazuha's friend had believed that someone out there could withstand the Musu no Hitotachi, could face the Shogun's ultimate technique, and survive. He had challenged the Shogun to prove his belief, and he had died for it, his vision going dark as his life ended. Kazuha carried his friend's masterless vision with him, unable to let go of the last piece of his companion. It was a vision that no longer glowed, a symbol of ambition, extinguished. But Kazuha believed his friend's conviction had been right, that somewhere someone could withstand the Musu no Hitatachi, could prove that human ambition and will were not so easily erased. The traveler also met Kamisato Ayaka, the daughter of the Yashiro Commission's ruling family. Ayaka was a vision bearer herself, someone who understood the terror of living under the Vision Hunt decree, knowing that at any moment, soldiers could come to take what was most precious to her. She had witnessed friends and acquaintances lose their visions, had seen them become hollow shells of their former selves. Yet she continued to resist in her own way, helping those she could while maintaining the appearance of loyalty to the shogunate. Through Ayaka and her brother Kamisato Hayato, the traveler learned about the political complexities of Inazuma. The tri-commission system was supposed to provide checks and balances. But with the shogun's authority absolute and her presence distant, the system had become corrupted. The Tenryou Commission had essentially seized control, using their military power to dominate the other commissions and enforce their will. The traveler journeyed to Watatsumi Island and met Sangonomiya Kokomi, the brilliant strategist leading the resistance forces. Kokomi explained that the resistance was not fighting to overthrow the shogun, but to end the Vision Hunt decree, to restore Inazuma to what it had been before this madness took hold. She believed that the shogun they knew, the god who had ruled Inazuma for centuries, would not truly want this suffering for her people. Something had changed, and they needed to find a way to reach her, to make her see what the Vision Hunt decree was doing. But reaching the Raiden Shogun was nearly impossible. She remained sequestered in Tenshukaku, appearing only for the Vision Hunt ceremony, when new visions were to be confiscated. The puppet followed its programming without deviation, seeing those who resisted as threats to eternity that needed to be eliminated. The traveler attempted to approach the shogun during a Vision Hunt ceremony, hoping to speak with her, to reason with her. But reason was not something the puppet was programmed to accept. When the traveler stood before the Raiden Shogun and challenged the Vision Hunt decree, she responded with the Musu no Hitotachi, the ultimate technique meant to cut down any who opposed her will. This should have been the end. The Musu no Hitotachi had never been survived, had never been blocked or deflected. It was an absolute attack, the manifestation of the Electro Archon's authority made into a single, world-ending strike. The traveler should have died, but in that moment, something miraculous occurred. Kazuha, who had been watching from the crowd, saw what was about to happen. He saw the shogun raise her blade, saw the technique his friend had died, trying to withstand being used against the traveler. And in that instant, his friend's masterless vision, the one that had gone dark when its bearer fell, began to glow once more. The vision responded not to Kazuha's ambition, but to his conviction, to the strength of his desire to honor his friend's belief, to save someone who stood where his friend had stood. Kazuha grasped the glowing vision and channeled its power, combining it with his own as he leapt forward, and blocked the Musu no Hitatachi. The impossible happened. The technique that had never been withstood was stopped. If only for a moment, it was enough. The traveler survived, and the Raiden Shogun, for the first time since they had retreated into meditation, was forced to pause and question. How had a mere mortal withstood her ultimate technique? What did this mean? But the puppet's programming reasserted itself quickly. The traveler was marked as a threat, someone to be eliminated at the next opportunity. They were forced to flee, saved by the intervention of Ayaka and other resistance sympathizers. The traveler realized that simply opposing the shogun would not work. She was too powerful, too absolute in her convictions. They needed to find another way, needed to reach not the puppet, but the woman inside. The real A who was meditating in her plane of euthymia, isolated from the world. Through research and consultation with Yae Miko, a powerful kitsune and the head shrine maiden of the Grand Narukami Shrine, the traveler learned the truth about the Raiden Shogun. They learned that she was a puppet, that the real Electro Archon was hidden away in meditation, that there had once been two gods ruling Inazuma. Yae Miko revealed herself as one of A's oldest friends, someone who had known both sisters and who had watched with growing concern as A's pursuit of eternity twisted into something harmful. Yae Miko had a plan. She could create a charm that would allow the traveler to enter the plane of euthymia, to confront A directly in her meditative realm. But this was dangerous. In that plane, A's will was absolute. She could simply erase the traveler from existence if she chose. Convincing her to change her mind would require more than just words. It would require proving that her vision of eternity was fundamentally flawed. The traveler accepted the risk. They had seen too much suffering, had met too many people whose lives had been destroyed by the Vision Hunt decree. If there was a chance to end this, they would take it, no matter the danger. But before they could attempt this, they needed to weaken the Shogun's conviction, needed to show her that her vision of eternity was already failing. The traveler worked with the resistance to expose the corruption in the Tenryo Commission, to reveal how the Kujo clan had been working with the Fatui, how the Vision Hunt decree was being used as a tool of oppression beyond what even the Shogun had intended. The revelation of this corruption shook Inazuma's government. The Raiden Shogun, confronted with evidence that her most trusted commission had betrayed her, was forced to acknowledge that something was wrong. Her puppet logic could not simply dismiss this. The corruption represented a threat to Inazuma's stability, to the order she was meant to maintain. But even this was not enough to change her fundamental position. The Vision Hunt decree remained in effect. The puppet simply removed the corrupt elements and continued with her mission. Eternity was still the goal, and nothing would be allowed to prevent its achievement. The traveler knew they had run out of time. The Fatui were making their move, preparing to steal E's gnosis, the symbol of her authority as an Archon. La Signora arrived at Tenshukaku to claim her prize, confident in the Fatui's diplomatic immunity and her organization's power. But the traveler challenged her to a duel before the throne, invoking ancient rites that even the Raiden Shogun had to acknowledge. If the traveler won, La Signora would be executed according to Inazuman law. If La Signora won, the traveler would die. It was a gamble, but one the traveler had to take. The battle was fierce, La Signora unleashing her full power as the Crimson Witch of Flames. But the traveler had grown stronger through their journey, had learned from the challenges they had faced. They defeated the Harbinger, and true to her word, the Raiden Shogun executed La Signora on the spot, her Musu no Hidotachi ending the Harbinger's life in an instant. With La Signora dead and the immediate threat dealt with, the traveler used Yae Miko's charm and entered the plane of euthymia. They passed through a doorway in reality itself and found themselves in a realm of pure meditation, a space of endless twilight where time had no meaning. There, they met A herself, not the puppet, but the real woman who had been hiding for 500 years. A appeared as she had when she first entered meditation, unchanged by time because she had experienced none. She challenged the traveler immediately, not with words but with action, drawing her blade and attacking. The traveler fought back, not to kill but to prove a point. They battled A in her own realm, where her power should have been absolute. And yet, despite having no vision, despite being a mortal facing a god in her own domain, the traveler held their own. They proved through combat that human will and determination could stand against divine authority, that ambition and growth made people stronger, not weaker. But more than that, the traveler spoke to A during their battle. They told her about the people they had met, about the suffering the Vision Hunt decree had caused. They spoke of Tepe, a resistance fighter who had used a Fatui supplied delusion to gain power, only to have it drain his life force, dying young because he wanted to be strong enough to make a difference. They spoke of Kazuha's friend, who died believing someone could withstand the Musu no Hitotachi, a belief that had proven true. They spoke of all the people whose ambitions had been stripped away, whose lives had been hollowed out by the loss of their visions. The traveler challenged A's understanding of eternity itself. They argued that true eternity was not stasis, but the continuation of change. That Inazuma's eternity lay not in freezing it in a single moment, but in ensuring it could adapt and survive through whatever changes came. They pointed out that by sealing herself away, by refusing to engage with the world, A had allowed corruption and suffering to flourish. Her pursuit of an unchanging eternity had instead created chaos and decay. Most powerfully, the traveler spoke of Makoto. They did not know the full details of Ie's loss, but they understood grief, understood what it meant to lose someone precious and be unable to protect them. They argued that Makoto would not have wanted this, would not have wanted Inazuma to become a prison for its own people in her name. These words, combined with the traveler's demonstration that human will could match divine power, finally broke through A's isolation. She was forced to confront what she had been avoiding for 500 years. That her sister was gone, that her grief had poisoned her judgment, that her pursuit of eternity had become a cage, not just for Inazuma but for herself. A allowed the traveler to show her visions of what Inazuma had become, to truly see the suffering her decrees had caused. She watched as people lost their visions and their sense of self. She saw families torn apart by the Sakoku decree. She witnessed the civil war raging between her own forces and those who resisted her will. She saw all of it, the pain and loss that had been inflicted in her name. And for the first time in 500 years, she truly felt the weight of what she had done. The realization shattered something in A. Her understanding of eternity, the philosophy she had built to protect herself from loss, crumbled in the face of reality. She had been so focused on preserving an ideal that she had lost sight of the actual nation she was meant to protect. In trying to prevent change, she had caused immense harm. In seeking to avoid loss, she had created countless new losses. A made a choice then that 500 years of meditation had not prepared her for. She chose to change. She chose to step out of her self-imposed isolation and take responsibility for what she had done. She chose to trust that Inazuma could endure without being frozen in time, that her people were strong enough to face whatever future came without needing to be controlled absolutely. The traveler returned to the physical world, and with them came a changed day. The Raiden Shogun puppet remained, still serving its function. But now A herself would be more present, would take a more active role in governing. More immediately, she announced the repeal of the Vision Hunt Decree. The decree's end did not erase the damage it had caused, but it was a beginning. Vision bearers who had gone into hiding could emerge. Those whose visions had been taken could potentially reclaim them, though whether their lost ambitions would return was uncertain. The visions embedded in the statue were returned to their bearers, and slowly, some of those who had lost themselves began to recover. The Sakoku decree was also lifted, though more gradually. Inazuma's borders reopened to trade and travel. Families separated for years were reunited. The nation began to reconnect with the rest of Teyvat, to catch up on the years of isolation and stagnation. But A's journey was far from over. She had 500 years of separation from her people to overcome. 500 years of decisions made by her puppet that she needed to understand and address. She had to learn how to be a ruler, something she had never truly been before. Where Makoto had understood governance instinctively, A had to learn it from scratch. A began by studying her own nation, by actually experiencing life in Inazuma rather than observing it from distant meditation. She walked among her people, though they did not always recognize her without the formal presence of the shogun. She tried the foods they ate, visited the places they visited, attempted to understand what daily life was like for those she ruled. This process was humbling and often confusing for A. She had spent so long focused on grand concepts like eternity and divinity that the simple realities of mortal existence were foreign to her. She did not understand commerce or why people valued certain things. She struggled with social norms and casual conversation. The warrior who could defeat any enemy in single combat was utterly lost when trying to navigate a marketplace or understand why people enjoyed novels. But A persisted. She recognized that understanding her people was essential if she was going to truly rule them, rather than simply imposing her will upon them. She sought guidance from those who understood humanity better than she did, particularly Yae Miko, who served as both friend and conscience, gently mocking A's struggles while also supporting her growth. Through Yae Miko, A learned about Makoto's final moments. Her sister had not died immediately in the cataclysm, but had lingered long enough to plant a seed, a sacred sakura tree that would one day grow to protect Inazuma. Makoto had also left behind her own understanding of eternity, one very different from E's. To Makoto, eternity was not the absence of change, but the continuation of beautiful moments. The way a single perfect instant could live forever in memory, even as time moved forward. This revelation helped A understand where she had gone wrong. She had tried to make time stop, to preserve a moment forever, by preventing any new moments from occurring. But Makoto's eternity was about creating moments worth remembering, experiences so meaningful that they would endure in hearts and minds, even as the world changed around them. A began to apply this understanding to her governance. Instead of trying to prevent all change, she focused on helping Inazuma adapt to change while preserving what was truly worth keeping. She supported reforms in the tribe commission system to prevent future corruption. She worked to heal the rifts created by the Civil War, reaching out to Watatsumi Island and the resistance forces to find peaceful resolution. The puppet Raiden Shogun remained, still handling many of the day-to-day functions of rule. But now it was guided by an A who was present and engaged, who could override its programming when necessary, who understood that absolute principles had to be tempered with wisdom and compassion. The relationship between A and her puppet became one of the most interesting aspects of her new approach to ruling. The puppet was not truly sentient, yet it had developed its own patterns and behaviors over 500 years of autonomous operation. It had memories and experiences that A herself did not share, having been isolated in meditation while the puppet interacted with the world. In a strange way, A had to get to know this version of herself, to understand what decisions it had made and why. The puppet had its own opinion about A's changes, or at least what passed for an opinion in its programming. It had been designed to pursue eternity through stasis, and A's new understanding of eternity conflicted with its core directives. Yet the puppet was also programmed to serve A's will, creating a logical paradox that it had to resolve. The solution it arrived at was fascinating. It would continue to represent the ideal of unwavering authority and absolute principle, while acknowledging A's right to override those principles when necessary. This dual nature of the Raiden Shogun, part unchanging puppet and part growing deity, became a symbol of Inazuma's new path. The nation would maintain its traditions and identity, represented by the puppet's consistency, while also adapting and evolving. Guided by A's newfound wisdom, A's personal growth extended beyond governance into understanding emotions and relationships in ways she never had before. As a warrior, she had been focused on duty and strength. As a meditating god pursuing eternity, she had suppressed all emotional connections that might create attachment and thus vulnerability to loss. But now, engaging with the world again, she had to confront the reality that emotions and connections were not weaknesses, but essential parts of existence. Her friendship with Yae Miko became particularly important during this time. Yae had known both A and Makoto, had served them faithfully for centuries, and had watched with growing concern as A retreated into herself after Makoto's death. Yae had tried to reach A multiple times over the 500 years, but the puppet had kept her at a distance, and A herself had been too isolated in meditation to truly listen. Now, finally, A was ready to hear what Yae had been trying to tell her all along. Yae spoke to her not as a subject to ruler, but as friend to friend, with the brutal honesty that only centuries of friendship allows. She told A that her pursuit of eternity had been a form of cowardice, a way of hiding from grief rather than processing it. She pointed out that Makoto would have been heartbroken to see what A had done to Inazuma in her name. These words were painful, but A accepted them. She recognized the truth in Yai's criticism and was grateful to have someone who cared enough to be honest with her, rather than simply deferring to her divine authority. Through conversations with Yai, A began to understand the value of friendship, of having someone who knew you well enough to call out your mistakes while still supporting your growth. A also had to confront the warriors who served her, particularly the vision bearers who had remained loyal despite the vision hunt decree. Many of them had hidden their visions or found ways to avoid confiscation, living in fear while continuing to serve the shogunate. Now, with the decree repealed, they emerged from hiding, and A had to face what her policies had done to them. Among these was Kujo Sara, the adopted daughter of the Kujo clan and a Tengu warrior of exceptional skill. Sara had been absolutely loyal to the Raiden Shogun, viewing her as a perfect being whose will was beyond question. She had enforced the vision hunt decree with rigid dedication, believing it was necessary for Inazuma's eternity. The revelation of her adopted family's corruption and the subsequent repeal of the decree shattered Sara's worldview. Sara had to reconcile her image of the perfect, unchanging shogun with the reality of a god who admitted mistakes and changed her mind. It was a difficult process, one that forced Sara to develop her own sense of judgment rather than simply following orders. Through this struggle, Sara became a more complete person, someone who could serve the shogun not through blind obedience, but through genuine loyalty based on shared values. A's relationship with Sara became emblematic of her new approach to leadership. Rather than demanding absolute obedience, A began to value those who could think independently, who could offer perspectives she might not have considered. She recognized that her isolation had left blind spots in her understanding, and she needed advisors who could fill those gaps. The reconciliation with Watatsumi Island and Sangonomiya Kokumi was more complex. The resistance had fought against the shogunate for years, had lost people in battle, had suffered under the vision hunt decree. Simply repealing the decree was not enough to heal those wounds. Kokumi, ever the strategist, understood that peace required more than just an end to hostilities. It required addressing the grievances that had led to war in the first place. Watatsumi had always felt marginalized within Inazuma, their worship of Arabashi, rather than the Raiden Shogun creating tension with the mainland. The vision hunt decree had been the breaking point, but underlying issues of representation and autonomy had existed long before. A had to engage with these issues directly, to understand why Watatsumi had felt the need to resist, and to find ways to ensure they felt valued as part of Inazuma. Through negotiations facilitated by the Yashiro Commission and Sangonomiya Kokumi, agreements were reached that gave Watatsumi greater autonomy in their internal affairs, while maintaining their connection to Inazuma as a whole. It was a compromise, not a perfect solution, but it represented something Aya had rarely done before, acknowledging that her way was not the only way, that different communities within Inazuma might have different needs. The healing of Inazuma was not just a political process, but a personal one for countless individuals. Those who had lost their visions during the decree had to find ways to reclaim their sense of self. Some recovered quickly once their visions were returned, their ambitions reigniting as if they had never been extinguished. Others found that the damage went deeper, that the trauma of loss and the time spent hollow had changed them in ways that could not be easily reversed. They witnessed these individual struggles and felt the weight of her responsibility for them. Each person whose life had been damaged by the vision hunt decree was a testament to her failure, a reminder of the cost of her pursuit of eternity. She could not undo what had been done, could not restore the time lost or the suffering endured, but she could ensure it never happened again. This led A to a deeper understanding of what it meant to be a leader. It was not about imposing one's will, no matter how well-intentioned. It was not about protecting people by controlling them. True leadership meant understanding those you led, trusting them to face challenges, and creating an environment where they could thrive while still providing guidance and protection when needed. A began to participate more directly in Inazuma's cultural life, something she had never done before. She attended festivals, not as a distant divine presence, but as a participant. She watched performances of traditional arts, visited shrines and temples, spoke with artisans and merchants. She was trying to understand not just the political structure of Inazuma, but its soul, the culture and traditions that gave her people identity and meaning. Through these experiences, A discovered aspects of humanity she had never appreciated before. She witnessed the joy people took in simple pleasures, the satisfaction of mastering a craft, the bonds formed through shared experiences. She began to understand why people valued things she had dismissed as ephemeral, why a beautiful but brief moment could be more precious than eternal stasis. One of A's most significant realizations involved the nature of memories and loss. She had tried to avoid loss by preventing change, by freezing everything in place so nothing could be taken from her. But she came to understand that memories of Makoto were more valuable than any attempt to preserve the world as it had been when Makoto was alive. Her sister lived on in the memories of those who knew her, in the culture she had nurtured, in the ideals she had championed. By trying to prevent any change from the time of Makoto's death, A had actually dishonored her sister's memory rather than preserving it. This understanding led A to seek out those who had known Makoto, to hear their stories and memories of her sister. Each story revealed facets of Makoto that A had never fully appreciated. Her sister had been more than just the gentle ruler A remembered. She had been curious, playful, deeply invested in the lives of individual citizens, someone who found joy in watching her nation grow and evolve. Through these stories, A constructed a more complete picture of Makoto, one that included the woman's hopes for Inazuma's future. Makoto had wanted the nation to flourish, to develop its culture and arts, to engage with the wider world. She had valued progress and growth, seeing them not as threats but as opportunities. The stagnation E had imposed was the opposite of everything Makoto had worked toward. This realization was both painful and liberating. Painful because it meant A had spent 500 years pursuing a goal that betrayed her sister's wishes. Liberating because it gave her a new direction, a way to truly honor Makoto's memory by fulfilling her sister's vision for Inazuma rather than trying to freeze the nation in the past. A's understanding of eternity continued to evolve through these experiences. She came to see it not as a static state, but as a dynamic process. Eternity was not about preventing change, but about ensuring continuity through change. It was about creating institutions and traditions strong enough to adapt without losing their essential character. It was about fostering a culture that could pass from generation to generation, evolving while maintaining its core identity. This new vision of eternity was much harder to achieve than the old one. Freezing everything in place required only power and will. Creating a nation that could endure through change required wisdom, flexibility, and trust in one's people. It required accepting that the future would be different from the present, that the Inazuma of 100 years hence would not be identical to the Inazuma of today, and that this was not only acceptable but desirable. A also had to confront the reality of her own nature as an Archon. She was not truly immortal in the sense of being immune to death, as Makoto's fate had proven, but she would likely outlive countless generations of humans, would see people she came to care about age and die while she remained unchanged. This was a form of suffering inherent to her existence, one that could not be avoided or prevented. Rather than trying to avoid attachment to protect herself from this suffering, A began to accept it as part of her role. The connections she formed with mortals would be temporary from her perspective, but they were still valuable. The pain of eventual loss was the price of meaningful relationships, and it was a price worth paying. This understanding represented a fundamental shift from her previous attempt to avoid all suffering through isolation. The question of what to do with her gnosis remained unresolved for some time. The gnosis was a symbol of her authority as an Archon, a physical manifestation of her connection to Celestia and the divine order of Tevat. But A had complicated feelings about it. The gnosis represented the system that had demanded Makoto's sacrifice in the Cataclysm, the divine hierarchy that had cost her sister's life. When the Fatui eventually approached again about the Gnosis, not through confrontation, but through negotiation with the newly reopened borders, AI made a surprising decision. She traded it away. To her, the Gnosis was not essential to her identity or her ability to rule Inazuma. Her power came from her own strength and will, not from a symbol granted by Celestia. By trading the Gnosis, she was making a statement. Her loyalty was to Inazuma and its people, not to the divine hierarchy that had taken her sister from her. This decision shocked many who learned of it, but it was consistent with A's evolution. She was choosing to define herself on her own terms rather than according to the role Celestia had assigned her. She was an Archon not because a Gnosis said she was, but because she had claimed that role and carried its responsibilities. A's journey also involved learning to balance her existence between her role as the Shogun and her nature as A. She was both a public figure who needed to maintain authority and dignity, and an individual with her own thoughts, feelings, and struggles. Finding this balance was difficult, as she had spent so long either performing a role or hiding completely. She began to allow herself small indulgences and personal interests, things that had nothing to do with governance or divine responsibility. She developed a fondness for sweet foods, particularly dango and desserts, finding simple pleasure in these treats. She spent time with friends like Yai Miko in informal settings, allowing herself to relax and just be A rather than the Raiden Shogun. These moments of normalcy were important for A's mental health and growth. They reminded her that she was not just a god or a ruler, but a person with her own identity. They provided balance to the weight of her responsibilities and helped prevent her from falling back into the pattern of defining herself entirely through her role. The puppet shogun's existence became less central as EA spent more time engaging directly with the world. The puppets still served important functions, handling routine matters and maintaining the image of consistency and authority. But more and more, it was A herself who appeared at important events, who made key decisions, who engaged with her people directly. This created some confusion among the populace, who sometimes encountered their shogun in unexpectedly casual settings or witnessed her displaying emotions and uncertainties they had never seen before. The propaganda of the puppet's 500-year reign had created an image of the Raiden Shogun as unchanging and absolute. Now, people were seeing a more human side to their god, and adjusting to this required time. Some welcomed this change, feeling that their Archon was finally accessible and relatable. Others were uncomfortable with it, preferring the distant but predictable divine authority they had known. This diversity of response was itself a learning experience for EI, teaching her that she could not please everyone, that any decision she made would have supporters and detractors. A's combat skills remained as formidable as ever, perhaps even more so now that she was actively engaging with the world rather than remaining isolated in meditation. She continued to train and refine her techniques, viewing martial excellence as a form of meditation and self-discipline. The Musu Ishin, her signature blade, remained a fearsome weapon, though now she wielded it with greater understanding of when violence was necessary and when other solutions were better. The technique that had defined her for so long, the Musu no Hidotachi, took on new meaning after her transformation. It was no longer just an ultimate attack meant to eliminate any who opposed her will. It became a symbol of her commitment to protecting Inazuma, a technique she would use only when absolutely necessary to defend what mattered most. The fact that it had been withstood by human determination did not diminish it. Rather, it elevated both the technique and the courage required to face it. A's relationship with the Traveler evolved into something unique. The Traveler was neither subject nor equal, neither servant nor friend in the traditional sense. They were someone who had challenged A at her lowest point and won, who had seen her weakness and offered redemption rather than judgment. There was a debt there, one that could never truly be repaid, and also a connection born of that crucial moment when A had finally been willing to change. The Traveler continued their journey across Teyvat, but they maintained contact with Inazuma, and with A specifically. They served as a valuable outside perspective, someone who could see Inazuma with fresh eyes and point out things that natives might take for granted. They also served as a reminder to EA of what she had learned. a living symbol of the power of human will and determination. Through her experiences and growth, A developed a new philosophy that guided her rule. She called it the path of progress within tradition. The idea was that Inazuma would honor its history and culture while still allowing for growth and adaptation. Traditions would be maintained not through rigid enforcement, but through genuine appreciation and voluntary participation. Change would be welcomed when it improved people's lives, but not at the cost of losing the nation's identity. This philosophy was tested regularly as Inazuma reconnected with the rest of Teyvat. Foreign ideas and technologies began to flow into the nation, bringing both opportunities and challenges. A had to decide what to embrace and what to reject, how to allow beneficial change while guarding against influences that might harm Inazuma's culture or people. She found that these decisions were rarely simple. The very things that made foreign influence potentially harmful also made it potentially beneficial. New ideas could enrich Inazuma's culture or dilute it, depending on how they were integrated. Foreign trade could bring prosperity or create dependency. Diplomatic relationships could provide security or entangle Inazuma in conflicts that were not its own. Navigating these complexities required exactly the kind of engaged, thoughtful leadership that A had avoided during her period of isolation. It required understanding context, considering multiple perspectives, and being willing to make difficult choices where no option was clearly correct. It was exhausting and often frustrating, but it was also necessary, and A came to accept this as part of her responsibility as Archon. The people of Inazuma gradually adjusted to their new reality. The older generation, who remembered the relative freedom before the Vision Hunt decree, found the return to openness familiar and welcome, though tinged with sadness for the years lost. The middle generation, who had lived through the decree and the Civil War, carried scars that would take time to heal. The youngest generation, who knew little beyond the closed nation and the hunt, had to learn to live in a world suddenly much larger and more complex than they had been raised to believe. Educational reforms became a priority, as Inazuma recognized that its period of isolation had left its people unprepared for engagement with the wider world. Schools began teaching foreign languages, world history, and international trade practices. These changes were controversial, with some viewing them as necessary modernization and others seeing them as abandonment of Inazuman values. A found herself having to defend these reforms, to explain that knowledge of the outside world did not mean rejection of Inazuman culture. She argued that understanding other nations and their ways actually strengthened Inazuma by allowing its people to engage with the world from a position of knowledge rather than ignorance. These arguments were not always convincing, and E had to accept that some would never agree with her new direction. The relationship between Inazuma's traditional warrior culture and the changing world was particularly complex. The samurai class, which had defined itself through service to the shogun and mastery of martial arts, found its role uncertain in an era of increasing peace and commercial development. Some adapted, finding new ways to serve Inazuma through diplomatic or administrative roles. Others clung to traditional ways, viewing any change as a betrayal of Bushido. A understood these struggles intimately, as she herself was fundamentally a warrior who had to learn to be something more. She tried to honor the warrior tradition, while also expanding the definition of what it meant to serve Inazuma. She argued that diplomacy required its own form of courage, that economic development served the nation as surely as military victory, that there were many ways to embody the samurai ideals of loyalty and honor. The sacred sakura tree that Makoto had planted continued to grow, becoming a living symbol of the connection between past and future. Its branches spread across Inazuma, providing protection and blessings to the land. A would sometimes stand beneath its boughs, speaking to her sister's memory, sharing her struggles and achievements. These one-sided conversations helped her process her emotions and maintain her connection to Makoto even as she forged her own path. Yaimiko occasionally teased A about these conversations, suggesting that talking to a tree was perhaps not the healthiest coping mechanism. But she also recognized their importance for A. The way they helped the Archon maintain balance between honoring the past and living in the present. The sacred Sakura was more than just a tree. It was a bridge between the sisters, between what was and what is. As years passed following the repeal of the Vision Hunt decree, Inazuma began to show signs of genuine recovery. Trade flourished as merchants re-established old connections and forged new ones. The arts, which had stagnated during the period of isolation, experienced a renaissance as artists incorporated foreign influences while maintaining distinctly Inazuman character. The population, while still carrying scars from the Civil War and the decree, gradually rebuilt their lives and communities. But recovery was not uniform or complete. Some regions, particularly those most affected by the fighting, struggled to rebuild. Some individuals never fully recovered from losing their visions, remaining hollow versions of their former selves, despite having their visions returned. The families of those who died in the Civil War carried grief that no policy change could address. These ongoing consequences of her mistakes remained visible to a constant reminder of the importance of her growth and vigilance. A made a practice of visiting these struggling areas and individuals personally when possible. She listened to their stories, acknowledged her responsibility for their suffering, and worked to provide whatever assistance she could. These were often painful encounters as she faced the human cost of her abstract pursuit of eternity. But she forced herself to witness these consequences rather than hiding from them, understanding that this discomfort was appropriate and necessary. The puppet shogun observed these changes with its peculiar form of awareness. It noted that A's new approach to ruling created more work, more complexity, more potential for error than the absolute principles it had been programmed to enforce. Yet it also observed that the nation was more stable, the people more content, and the threats to Inazuma's long-term survival fewer under A's engaged leadership than they had been under the puppet's rigid rule. The puppet processed this information according to its directives and concluded that A's approach better served the goal of Inazuma's continuation, even if it conflicted with the puppet's original understanding of how to achieve that goal. This evolution in the puppet's logic represented a form of growth for the artificial being. It was learning to distinguish between its programmed principles and the ultimate purpose those principles were meant to serve. When the two conflicted, it was beginning to defer to purpose over principle, to recognize that the rules were meant to serve the goal rather than being ends in themselves. This made the puppet a more effective tool for A, able to handle complex situations with greater nuance than its original programming would have allowed. A's personal life, such as it was for a god, began to include genuine friendships beyond her long relationship with Yae Miko. She developed a rapport with members of the Yashiro Commission, particularly the Kamisato siblings, who had done so much to support the resistance and preserve Inazuma during its darkest period. She came to respect Sangonomiya Kokomi's strategic brilliance and dedication to her people, finding in the young shrine maiden a kindred spirit who understood the burden of leadership. These relationships were not without awkwardness, as A still struggled with social interactions and often missed cues or misunderstood situations. But her friends and allies showed patience with her growth, recognizing that an ancient warrior god learning to function in casual social settings was bound to make mistakes. Their willingness to accept her imperfections while still holding her accountable for her responsibilities provided A with a support network she had lacked during her 500 years of isolation. The question of succession began to arise in political discussions. Though it was a sensitive topic, A was effectively immortal from a human perspective, likely to rule for thousands of years more, but the events of the Vision Hunt decree had demonstrated the dangers of leaving power entirely in the hands of an isolated ruler, even a divine one. Various proposals emerged for creating stronger checks on the Archon's authority, for establishing systems that could function even if A again retreated from active rule. A listened to these proposals with interest rather than offense. She recognized that they came from a reasonable concern, that her people had valid reasons to want protections against the kind of tyranny that had emerged during her isolation. She supported reforms that gave the Tri-Commission greater authority and independence, that created legal frameworks, limiting what even the Archon could decree without consultation and review. These changes represented a significant shift from the absolute authority she had once claimed, but A saw them as necessary safeguards for Inazuma's future. The implementation of these reforms faced resistance from traditionalists, who viewed any limitation on the Archon's authority as heresy. They argued that a god's wisdom was by definition superior to mortal judgment, that creating checks on divine power was an insult to the Raiden Shogun and an invitation to chaos. A had to carefully explain that she was not diminishing her own authority, but rather choosing to exercise it differently. That true strength included the wisdom to accept counsel and limitation. These political struggles were exhausting for A, who had little natural aptitude for the kind of patient negotiation and compromise they required. More than once, she complained to Yai Miko that battles were simpler than politics, that she could defeat any enemy in single combat, but found it far harder to build consensus among bureaucrats and nobles with competing interests. Yai would laugh and remind her that this was exactly why Makoto had handled governance, while A fought battles, and why A now had to learn what her sister had known instinctively. As Inazuma stabilized and began to thrive under A's more engaged leadership, the nation's relationship with Celestia remained uncertain. A had traded away her gnosis, symbolically distancing herself from the divine hierarchy. She was still an Archon in terms of power and authority, but she no longer fit neatly into the system Celestia had established. The implications of this independence were unclear, and A sometimes wondered if there would eventually be consequences for her choice. But she did not regret it. The gnosis had represented an authority imposed from above, a role assigned rather than claimed. By giving it up, A had declared that her loyalty was to Inazuma first, to its people and their well-being above any divine mandate. If Celestia took issue with that, she would face those consequences when they came, confident in the rightness of her choice. The traveler's journey eventually took them beyond Inazuma, as they continued their search for their lost sibling and their investigation into the mysteries of Teyvat. But before leaving, they spent time with A, reflecting on how far both of them had come since their first confrontation. The traveler expressed pride in what Aya had achieved, in her growth from an isolated god pursuing an impossible dream to an engaged ruler, working to build a better future for her nation. A thanked the traveler for their role in her transformation, acknowledging that without their intervention, she would likely still be in her plane of euthymia, oblivious to the suffering she had caused, pursuing an eternity that was really just elaborate avoidance of grief. The traveler had given her not just a second chance, but a wake-up call, a reminder that gods could be wrong and that admitting error was not weakness but wisdom. As the traveler departed, A stood at the docks of Rito, watching their ship disappear toward the horizon. She thought about journeys and destinations, about how her own journey was far from over, even though she had been alive for thousands of years. She had spent so long trying to reach a final destination called eternity, but she now understood that the journey itself was what mattered. That eternity was found in the path rather than the endpoint. She turned back toward Inazuma City, toward Tenshukaku, where both she and her puppet awaited the next day's challenges. There would be more struggles, more difficult decisions, more mistakes to make and hopefully learn from. But there would also be moments of beauty and connection, small victories and unexpected joys. This was the eternity Makoto had understood, the one worth pursuing, not the frozen stasis A had once sought, but the endless flow of meaningful moments that made existence worthwhile. The story of the Raiden Shogun, of A and her pursuit of eternity, is ultimately a story about grief and growth, about the dangers of trying to avoid pain and the necessity of accepting it as part of life. It is about the difference between ruling and leading, between imposing your will and understanding those you serve. It is about the courage required to admit you were wrong, and the strength needed to change fundamental beliefs that have defined you for centuries. A's journey reminds us that even gods can be flawed, that power without wisdom is dangerous regardless of how well-intentioned it might be. It shows us that isolation, even when undertaken to protect oneself or others, often causes more harm than the vulnerability it seeks to avoid. And it demonstrates that it is never too late to change, that growth is possible at any age, or after any length of time, as long as one is willing to face uncomfortable truths and do the hard work of transformation. The people of Inazuma, who lived through the Vision Hunt decree and its aftermath, will carry those experiences with them for generations. Some will remember the terror and loss, passing down stories of the dark time when ambitions were seized and the nation became a prison. Others will remember the resilience and resistance, the ordinary people who stood up against a god's misguided decree. And future generations will learn from both, understanding that freedom and prosperity must be actively protected, that authority must be questioned even when divine, and that the greatest strength lies not in unchanging principles, but in the wisdom to adapt and grow. As for A herself, she continues her work as Archon of Inazuma, no longer pursuing an impossible eternity, but rather creating moments worth remembering, building a nation that can endure through change rather than in spite of it, and honoring her sister's memory, not by freezing time at the moment of her death, but by fulfilling the vision of progress and growth that Makoto had championed. She has learned that eternity is not about preventing endings, but about ensuring that what matters most continues forward, evolving and adapting, but never losing its essential character. This is the story of the Raiden Shogun, of the god who tried to stop time and learned instead to embrace its passage, of the warrior who became a leader, of the isolated deity who rejoined the world she ruled. It is a story still being written, each day adding new moments to Inazuma's continuing journey toward an eternity, defined not by stasis, but by endurance, not by perfection, but by resilience, not by avoiding change, but by weathering it with grace and growing stronger through each challenge faced. And so the eternal rule of Inazuma continues, but eternity itself has been redefined. It is no longer the absence of change, but the presence of meaning, no longer the preservation of a single moment, but the creation of countless moments worth preserving in memory and heart. This is the true eternity that Makoto understood, and that A, after 500 years and immeasurable growth, has finally come to embrace. May we all be so fortunate in our own journeys, learning as A did that the pursuit of an impossible perfection pales before the beauty of authentic growth, messy and imperfect and infinitely more valuable than any frozen ideal could ever be.